Hey, this is Anthony Pacheco of Griffon Games. More map stretch goal number 2 is down. So tremendous. We have plans. This will make the map folio that much more compelling. And if you're on the printed map tier, you'll get a heck of a deal. You're going to open up that shipping tube and out pours high quality map goodness you don't normally see in Adventure Path modules. So let's talk about hard fantasy. Brandon Sanderson writes some excellent fantasy, and to paraphrase him, hard fantasy is more about what you can't do with magic than what you can. Here's where that intersects RPGs. A DM that subscribes to the tenets of hard fantasy has a rather large narrative tool in the DM toolbox. By defining restrictions and limits, a DM's campaign world becomes more fantastic, not less. From the Planetary Knowledge Core, hard fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy literature that strives to present stories set in, and often centered on, a rational and noble world. Hard fantasy is like hard science fiction, from which it draws its name, in that both aim to build their respective worlds in a rigorous and logical manner. The hard aspect of hard fantasy can refer to different elements. It can refer to a consistent history and folklore, as we see from Lord of the Rings, well-defined magic systems as seen in Mistborn or The Name of the Wind, and sometimes even applied to A Song in Fire and Ice for its political system, though the latter only defines limits of magic the main characters learn. Here at Griffon Games, we are big fans of hard fantasy. We feel that beyond a descriptive, logical definition of how magic works, hard fantasy has other attributes. Motivational. NPCs have motivations, both covert and overt. Political. The fantasy world has movers and shakers, those that fight the status quo and those that try to preserve it. Historical. The current world can be explained by describing what has come before. Villainous. The bad guys are not the bad guys in their own story, and on the off chance they recognize that they are the bad guys, they have the distinctive motivations for being so. Magical. The story doesn't drive the magical system where horrific miracles happen because suddenly it's the middle of the book and the hero needs a low point. The magic system codifies the story, not the other way around. Mythical. All people have a creation myth, and the magical and historical items and people within the world have lore that defines them, even if the lore isn't accurate. Divine. Especially with RPGs, the divine impacts the people and the people impact the gods. With hard fantasy, what the gods can't do is just, if not more, interesting and useful to the DM, what they can do. Geographical. The fantasy world has distinctive, descriptive geography that shapes all the other hard fantasy attributes. Now, if you're into rolling your own campaign setting or heavily modifying existing campaign worlds, and all of that sounded like a bullet list for world building, now you get it. If you apply the classic definition of hard fantasy to campaign world attributes, that's where the magic happens. Hard fantasy is the whole package. It's gritty, it's rich, it makes sense, and sometimes you can win the battle but lose the war. It's a fantasy world that breathes. We'll talk about win-lose conditions on another video, but let's go back to hard fantasy. Curse of the Lost Memories is a hard fantasy module that you can insert into an existing campaign world or use the world presented in the module. The adventure is part 1 of the Chronicles of the Celestial Chains adventure path. The module is self-contained, just as many hard fantasy elements are self-contained. Leave no doubt the adventure is fantastical. You can say we're trying to foster a rich and detailed dream world of the fantastic. But like hard fiction that subscribes to a rational science with roots in realism, we're not going to pull some fantasy magical event that doesn't conform to our fantasy framework just to progress the story. And that's the core of hard fantasy. Hard fantasy makes worlds more believable, not less. It makes them more detailed, not the absence of detail. When the story conforms to the world presented, then that world comes alive. And a world that seems alive is a place you want to come back to. When your players have the narrative impression that portions of the world continue when they are not there, that's a heroic fantasy land which defines some of the best RPG game moments. And when your players are invested in a hard fantasy narrative, I would assert that they are driving the story instead of the story driving them. That's the classical difference between a static MMO world that changes only with expansion updates and a fantasy-based campaign. Your D&D or Pathfinder game has no second chances. There are no takebacks, no adventure restarts. It's a one-way trip because hard fantasy doesn't allow the retcon. Well, it could if you're some 18th level wizard with forbidden lore, but I digress. So, Griffon Lore Games recognizes that there are a lot of good modules with distinctive RPG styles. For example, Goodman Games' Dungeon Crawl Classics are great classical-styled modules that are a lot like AD&D modules in the late 70s and early 80s. More recently, there are also adventure paths that tell an epic story from levels 1 to 18 and beyond. And that's a pretty epic adventure arc. Our niche we're going to carve out is a hard fantasy play. All the hard fantasy attributes I talked about earlier are our product attributes. We're here to give the DM the best product they can buy to run the best game that they can run. And with that, I want to once again thank our backers for joining Griffon Lore Games in the creation of our first module, Curse of Lost Memories. The next update video, we'll talk about our stretch goals. Some of the ones we have coming up are going to be a great deal for our backers. It's going to be epic!